Open Stax Psychology, Chapter 6, Learning. Introduction. The summer sun shines bright on a deserted stretch of beach. Suddenly, a tiny gray head emerges from the sand, then another and another. Soon the beach is teeming with longer head sea turtle hatchlings. Although only minutes old, the hatchlings know exactly what to do. Their flippers are not very efficient for moving across the sand, yet they continue onward instinctively. Some are quickly snapped up by gulls circling overhead, and others become lunch for hungry ghost crabs that dart out of their holes. Despite these dangers, the hatchlings are driven to leave the safety of their nests and find the ocean. Not far down this same beach, Ben and his son Julian paddled out into the ocean on surfboards. A wave approaches. Julian crouches on his board, then jumps up and rides the wave for a few seconds before losing his balance. He emerges from the water in time to watch his father ride the face of the wave. Unlike baby sea turtles, which know how to find the ocean and swim with no help from their parents, we are not born knowing how to swim or surf. Yet we humans pride ourselves in our ability to learn. In fact, over thousands of years and across cultures, we have created institutions devoted entirely to learning. But have you ever asked yourself, how exactly is it that we learn? What processes are at work as we come to know what we know? This chapter focuses on the primary ways in which learning occurs. Section 6.1. What is learning? Birds build nests and migrate as winter approaches. Infants suckle at their mother's breasts. Dogs shake water off wet fur. Salmon swim upstream to spawn, and spiders spin in tracked webs. What do these seemingly unrelated behaviors have in common? They are all unlearned behaviors. Both instincts and reflexes are innate behaviors that organisms are born with. Reflexes are a motor or neural reaction to a specific stimulus in the environment. They tend to be simpler than instincts involve the activity of specific body parts and systems, and involve more primitive centers of the central nervous system. In contrast, instincts are innate behaviors that are triggered by a broad range of events, such as aging and the change of season. They are more complex patterns of behaviors, involve movement of the organisms as a whole, and involve higher brain centers. Both reflexes and instincts help an organism adapt to its environment and do not have to be learned. For example, every healthy human baby has a suckling reflex present at birth. Babies are born knowing how to suckle on a nipple, whether artificial from a bottle or human. Nobody teaches the baby to suck, just as no one teaches a sea turtle hatchling to move towards the ocean. Learning, like reflexes and instincts, allow an organism to adapt to its environment. But unlike instincts and reflex, learned behaviors involve change and experience. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. In contrast to the innate behaviors discussed above, learning involves acquiring knowledge and skills through experience. Looking back at our surfing scenario, Julian will have to spend much more time training with his surfboard before he learned how to ride the waves like his father. Learning to surf, as well as any complex learning process, involves a complex interaction of conscious and unconscious processes. Learning has traditionally been studied in terms of its simplest components, the associations our minds automatically make between events. Our minds have a natural tendency to connect events that occur closely together or in sequence. Associative learning occurs when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. You will see that associative learning is central to all three basic learning processes discussed in this chapter. Classical conditioning tends to involve unconscious processes. Operant conditioning tends to involve conscious processes, and observational learning adds social and cognitive layers to all the basic associative processes, both conscious and unconscious. These learning processes will be discussed in detail later in the chapter, but it is helpful to have a brief overview of each as you begin to explore how learning is understood from a psychological perspective. In classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, organisms learn to associate events or stimuli that repeatedly happen together. We experience this process throughout our daily lives. For example, you might see a flash of lightning in the sky during a storm and then hear a loud boom of thunder. The sound of the thunder naturally makes you jump. Because lightning reliably predicts the impending boom of thunder, you may associate the two and jump when you see lightning. Psychological research study this associative process by focusing on what can be seen and measured. Behaviors. Researchers ask if one stimuli triggers a reflex, can we train a different stimulus to trigger that same reflex? In operant conditioning, organisms learn again to associate events, a behavior, and its consequence. A pleasant consequence encourages more of that behavior in the future, whereas a punishment deters the behavior. Imagine you are teaching your dog, Hooter, to sit. You tell Hooter to sit and give him a treat when he does. After repeated experiences, Hooter begins to associate the act of sitting with receiving a treat. He learns that the consequences of sitting is that he gets a doggy biscuit. Conversely, if the dog is punished when exhibiting a behavior, it becomes conditioned to avoid that behavior. Observational learning extends the effect range of both classical and operant conditioning, in contrast to classical and operant conditioning, in which learning occurs only through direct experience. Observational learning is the process of watching others and then imitating what they do. A lot of learning among humans and other animals come from observational learning. To get an idea of the extra effective range that observational learning brings, consider Ben and his son Julian from the introduction. How might observation help Julian learn to surf, as opposed to learning by trial and error alone? By watching his father, he can imitate the moves that bring success and avoid the moves that lead to failure. Can you think of something you have learned how to do after watching someone else? All of the approaches covered in this chapter are part of a particular tradition in psychology called behaviorism, which we discussed in the next section. However, these approaches do not represent the entire study of learning. Separate traditions of learning have taken shape within different fields of psychology, such as memory and cognition. So you will find that other chapters will round out your understanding of the topic. Over time, these traditions tend to converge. For example, in this chapter, you will see how cognition has come to play a large role in behaviorism, whose more extreme adherents once insisted that behaviors are triggered by the environment with no intervening thought. Section 6.2 Classical Conditioning. Does the name Ivan Pavlov ring a bell? Even if you are new to the study of psychology, chances are that you have heard of Pavlov and his famous dogs. Pavlov, a Russian scientist, performed extensive research on dogs and is best known for his experiments in classical conditioning. As we discussed briefly in the previous section, classical conditioning is a process by which we learn to associate stimuli and consequently to anticipate events. Pavlov came to his conclusion about how learning occurs completely by accident. Pavlov was a psychologist, he was a sociologist, not a psychologist. Okay, I was very wrong there. So I'm going to start again. Pavlov came to his conclusion about how learning occurs completely by accident. Pavlov was a physiologist, not a psychologist. Physiologists study the life process of organisms from the molecular level to the level of cells, organ systems, and entire organisms. Pavlov's area of interest was the digestive system. In his studies with dogs, Pavlov surgically implanted tubes inside of dogs' cheeks to collect saliva. He then measured the amount of saliva produced in response to various foods. Over time, Pavlov observed that dogs began to salivate not only at the taste of food, but also at the sight of food, at the sight of an empty bowl, and even at the sound of the laboratory's assistant's footsteps. Salivating to food in the mouth is reflexive, so no learning is involved. However, dogs don't naturally salivate at the sight of an empty bowl or the sound of footsteps. These unusual responses intrigued Pavlov, and he wondered what accounted for what he called the dog's psychic secretions. To explore this phenomenon in an objective manner, Pavlov designed a series of carefully controlled experiments to see which stimuli would cause the dogs to salivate. He was able to train the dog to salivate in response to stimuli that clearly had nothing to do with food, such as the sound of a bell, a light, and a touch on the leg. Through his experiment, Pavlov realized that an organism has two types of responses to its environment: unconditioned responses or reflexes, and conditioned responses. In Pavlov's experiments, the dogs salivated each time meat powder was presented to them. The meat powder in this situation was an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that elicits reflexive responses in an organism. The dog's salivation was an unconditioned response, a natural reaction to given stimulus. Before conditioning, think of the dog's stimulus and responses like this: meat powder to salivation. In classical conditioning, a natural stimulus is presented immediately before an unconditioned stimulus. Pavlov would sound a tone and then give the dogs meat powder. The tone was a natural stimulus, which is a stimulus that does not naturally elicit a response. Prior to conditioning, the dogs did not salivate when they just heard the tone, because the tone had no association for the dogs. Quite simply, this pairing means tone plus meat powder equals salivation. When Pavlov paired the tone with the meat powder over and over again, the previously neutral stimulus also began to elicit salivation. Thus, the natural stimulus being the conditioned stimulus, which is a stimulus that elicits a response after repeatedly being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, the dogs began to salivate to the tone alone. Just as they had previously salivated at the sound of the assistant's footsteps. The behavior caused by the conditioned stimulus is called the conditioned response. In the case of Pavlov's dog, they had learned to associate the tone with being fed, and they began to salivate in anticipation of food. Tones to salivation. Real-world application of classical conditioning. How does classical conditioning work in the real world? Let's say you have a cat named Tiger who is quite spoiled. You keep her food in a separate cabinet, and you also have special electric can openers that use only to open cans of cat food. For every meal, Tiger hears the distinctive sound of the electric can opener and then gets her food. Tiger quickly learns that when she hears the can opener, she is about to get fed. What do you think Tiger does when she hears the electric can opener? She will likely get excited and run to where you are preparing her food. This is an example of classical conditioning. In this case, what are the UCSs, CS, UCR, and CR? What if the cabinet holding Tiger's food became squeaky? In that case, Tiger hears the cabinets, the electric can opener, and then she gets her food. Tiger will learn to get excited when she hears the squeak of the cabinet. Pairing a new neutral stimulus, squeak, with the conditioned stimulus of the can opener is called higher order conditioning or second order conditioning. This means you are using the conditioned stimulus of the can opener to condition another stimulus, the squeaky cabinet. It is hard to achieve anything above second order conditioning. For example, if you ring a bell, open the cabinet, use the can opener, and then feed Tiger, Tiger will likely never get excited while hearing the bell alone. Classical conditioning also applies to humans, even babies. For example, Sarah buys formula in blue canisters for her 6-month-old daughter, Angelina. Whenever Sarah takes out a formula container, Angelina gets excited, tries to reach towards the food, and most likely salivates. Why does Angelina get excited when she sees the formula canister? What are the UCS, CS, UCR, and CR here? So far, all of the examples have involved food, but classical conditioning extends beyond the basic needs to be fed. Consider our earlier example of a dog whose owner installs an invisible electric dog fence. A small electric shock elicits discomfort. When the unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, the dog associates the discomfort with the edge of the yard and stays within the set boundaries. In this example, the edge of the yard elicits fear and anxiety in the dog. Fear and anxiety are the conditioned responses. General processes in classical conditioning. Now that you know how classical conditioning works and have seen several examples, let's take a look at some of the general processes involved. In classical conditioning, the initial period of learning is known as acquisition. When an organism learns to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus during acquisition. During acquisition, the natural stimulus begins to elicit the conditioned response, and eventually the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus capable of eliciting the conditioned response by itself. Timing is important for conditioning to occur. Typically, there should only be a brief interval between presentation of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Depending on what is being conditioned, sometimes this interval is as little as 5 seconds. However, with other types of conditioning, the interval can be up to several hours. Taste aversion is a type of conditioning in which an interval of several hours may pass between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Here's how it works. Between classes, you and a friend grab a quick lunch from a food court on campus. You share a dish of chicken curry and head off to your next class. A few hours later, you feel nauseous and become ill. Although your friend is fine and you determine that you have intestinal flu, you've developed a taste aversion. The next time you are at a restaurant and someone orders curry, you immediately feel ill. While the chicken dish is not what made you sick, you are experiencing taste aversion. You've been conditioned to be averse to a food after a single negative experience. How does this occur? Conditioning based on a single instance and involving an extended time lapse between the event and the negative stimulus. Research into taste aversion suggests that this response may be an evolutionary adaptation designed to help organisms quickly learn to avoid harmful food. Not only may this contribute to species survival via natural selection, but it may also help us develop strategies for challenges such as helping cancer patients through the nausea induced by certain treatments. Once we have established the connection between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, how do we break that connection and get the dog, cat, or child to stop responding? In Tiger's case, imagine what would happen if you stopped using the electric can opener for her food and began to use it only for human food. Now Tiger would hear the can opener, but she would not get food. In classical conditioning terms, you would be given the conditioned stimulus, but not the unconditioned stimulus. Pavlov explored this scenario in his experiment with dogs, sounding the tone without giving the dogs the meat powder. Soon, the dogs stopped responding to the tone. Extinction is the decrease in the conditioned response when the unconditioned stimulus is no longer presented with the conditioned stimulus. When presented with the conditioned stimulus alone, the dog, cat, or other organism would show a weaker and weaker response, and finally no response. In classical conditioning terms, there is a gradual weakening and disappearance of the conditioned response. What happens when learning is not used for a while? When what was learned lies dormant. As we just discussed, Pavlov found that when he repeatedly presented the bell without the meat powder, extinction occurred. The dogs stopped salivating to the bell. However, after a couple of hours of resting his extinction training, the dogs again began to salivate when Pavlov rang the bell. What do you think would happen when Tiger's behavior with Tiger's behavior, if your electric can opener broke and you did not use it for several months, when you finally got it fixed and started using it to open Tiger's food again, Tiger would remember the association between the can opener and her food. She would get excited and run to the kitchen when she heard the sound. The behavior of Pavlov's dogs and Tiger illustrates a concept Pavlov called spontaneous recovery, the return of a previous extinguished conditioned response following a rest period. Of course, these processes also apply in humans. For example, let's say that every day when you walk to campus, an ice cream truck passes your route. Day after day, you hear the truck's music. So you finally stop and purchase a chocolate ice cream bar. You take a bite, and then your mouth waters. This initial period of learning is known as acquisition, when you begin to connect the natural stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. During acquisition, the conditioned response gets stronger and stronger through repeated pairing of the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. Several days later, you notice that your mouth begins to water as soon as you hear the truck's music. Even before you bite into the ice cream bar, one day you have Then one day you head down the street, you hear the truck's music, and your mouth waters. However, when you get to the truck, you discover they are all out of ice cream. You leave disappointed. The next few days you pass the truck and hear the music, but don't stop to get an ice cream bar because you're running late for class. You begin to salivate less and less when you hear the music, until by the end of the week your mouth no longer waters when you hear the tune. This illustrates extinction. The conditioned response weakens when only the conditioned stimulus is presented, without being followed by the unconditioned stimulus. Then the weekend comes. You don't have to go to class, so you don't pass the truck. Monday morning arrives, and you take your usual route to campus. You round the corner and hear the truck again. What do you think happens? Your mouth begins to water again. Why? After a break from conditioning, the conditioned response reappears, which indicates spontaneous recovery. Acquisition and extinction involve the strengthening and weakening, respectively, of a learned association. Two other learning processes, stimulus discrimination and stimulus generalization, are involved in distinguishing which stimuli will trigger the learned association. Animals, including humans, need to distinguish between stimuli, for example, between sounds that predict a threatening event and sounds that do not, so that they can respond appropriately. When an organism learns to respond differently to various stimuli that are similar, it is called stimulus discrimination. A classical conditioning term. The organism demonstrates the conditioned response only to the conditioned stimulus. Pavlov's dog discriminated against the basic tones that sounded before they were fed and other tones because the other sounds did not predict the arrival of food. Similarly, Tiger, the cat, discriminated between the sound of the can opener and the sound of the electric mixer. When the electric mixer is going, Tiger is not about to be fed, so she does not come running to the kitchen looking for food. On the other hand, when an organism demonstrates the conditioned response to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus, it is called stimulus generalization, the opposite of stimulus discrimination. The more similar a stimulus is to the conditioned stimulus, the more likely the organism is to give the conditioned response. For instance, if the electric mixer sounds very similar to the electric can opener, Tiger may come running after hearing its sound. But if you do not feed her following the electric mixer sound, and you continue to feed her consistently after the electric can opener sound, she will quickly learn to discriminate between the two sounds. Sometimes classical conditioning can lead to Habituation. Habituation occurs when we learn not to respond to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly without change. As the stimulus occurs over and over, we learn not to focus our attention on it. For example, imagine that your neighbor or roommate consistently has the television blaring. This background noise is distracting and makes it difficult for you to focus when you're studying. However, over time you become accustomed to the stimulus of the television noise, and eventually you hardly notice it any longer. Behaviorism. John B. Watson is considered the founder of behaviorism. Behaviorism is a school of thought that arose during the first part of the 20th century, which incorporates elements of Pavlov's classical conditioning. In stark contrast with Freud, who considered the reason for behavior to be hidden in the unconscious, Watson championed the idea that all behavior can be studied as a simple stimulus-response reaction without regards for internal processes. Watson argued that in order for psychology to become a legitimate science, it must shift concern away from internal mental processes because mental processes cannot be seen or measured. Instead, he asserted that psychology must focus on outward observable behaviors that can be measured. Watson's ideas influenced by Pavlov's work. According to Watson, human behavior, just like animal behavior, is primarily the result of conditioned responses. Whereas Pavlov's work with dogs involved the conditioning of reflexes, Watson believed that the same principle could be extended to the conditioning of human emotions. Thus began Watson's work with his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, and a baby called Little Albert. Through their experiment with little Albert, Watson and Rayner demonstrated how fears can be conditioned. In 1920, Watson was the chair of the psychology department at Johns Hopkins University. Through his position at the university, he came to meet little Albert's mother, Arvilla Merritt, who worked at a campus hospital. Watson offered her $1 to allow her son to be the subject of his experiment in classical conditioning. Through these experiments, little Albert was exposed to and conditioned to fear certain things. Initially, he was presented with various neutral stimuli, including a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks, cotton wool, and a white rat. He was not afraid of any of these things. Then, Watson, with the help of Rayner, conditioned little Albert to associate these stimuli with an emotion, fear. For example, Watson handed little Albert the white rat, and little Albert enjoyed playing with it. Then Watson made a loud sound by striking the hammer against the metal bar hanging behind little Albert's head. Each time little Albert touched the rat, little Albert was frightened by the sound, demonstrating a reflexive fear of sudden loud noises, and began to cry. Watson repeatedly paired the loud sound with the white rat. Soon little Albert became frightened by the white rat alone. In this case, what are the UCS, CS, UCR, and CR? Days later, little Albert demonstrated stimulus generalization. He became afraid of other furry things. He became afraid of other furry things, a rabbit, a furry coat, and even Santa Claus's mask. Watson had succeeded in conditioning a fear response in little Albert, thus demonstrating that emotions could become conditioned responses. It had been Watson's intention to produce a phobia, a persistent excessive fear of a specific object or situation, through conditioning alone, thus countering Freud's view that phobias are caused by deep hidden conflicts in the mind. However, there is no evidence that little Albert experienced phobias in later years. Little Albert's mother moved away, ending the experiments, and little Albert himself died a few years later of unrelated causes. While Watson's research provided new insight into conditioning, it would be considered unethical by today's standards.